Hello, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all. I'm delighted to welcome you all to the final day of the I-Humanities College Summer School of Literary Theory and Philosophy 2021, which is a joint initiative between the University of Wales, Trinity St. David, and St. Berkman's College, Chavanasheri, Kerala. I need to make a couple of announcements to the attendees. Number one, the guidelines for paper submissions are already available in the groups. We will, however, email it to all of you for your future reference. From Monday onwards, we will issue the course completion certificate. We request you to fill out the feedback form accurately. Any mistakes or spelling errors in your submission will be reflected in the certificate. So please fill out the feedback form carefully. The link to the recordings of the summer school will be shared with the participant next week, as many of them requested these recordings. But not all recordings are available, only those for which we have permission will be made available. In addition, we encourage you to visit the websites of I-Humanities College and St. Berkman's College, Chavanasheri for future academic events. So following the Q&A, we will have the valedictory function. So we request you to remain for the valedictory function as well. Rebecca will chair today's session and she will introduce the speaker of the day, Professor Raimond Gaita. So over to you, Rebecca. Rebecca, can you unmute yourself? Rebecca, can you unmute yourself?
Okay, thank you. Sorry, just a technical glitch there. So it's absolutely great delight today for me and for you guys, I'm sure, that we have Professor Raimond Gaita here. And he will be giving a talk today. So it's a real honour to have him with us. Raimond Gaita is a professorial fellow in the Melbourne Law School and the Faculty of Arts at the University of Melbourne, and Emeritus Professor of Moral Philosophy at King's College London. He is a Fellow of the Australian Academy of the Humanities, and his books have been widely translated, and they include Good and Evil, An Absolute Conception, the award-winning Romulus, My Father, which was nominated by the New Statesman as one of the best books of 1999. And it was also made into a film, of course. And then there was the book A Common Humanity, Thinking About Love and Truth and Justice, which was nominated by The Economist as one of the best books of 2000. And The Philosopher's Dog, which of course you've had some excerpts today for the reading for this talk. That was shortlisted for the New South Wales Premier's Award and the Age Book of the Year. Other books include Breach of Trust, Truth, Morality and Politics. And he was also editor and contributor to Gaza, Morality, Law and Politics. Another book, Muslims, and another one, Multiculturalism. Who's Afraid of International Law, which was edited with Jerry Simpson, and the book On Dignity was published in 2012. And because Professor Gaita believes that it's generally a good thing for philosophers to address an educated and hard-thinking lay audience, as well as academics and colleagues, Gaita has contributed extensively to public discussion about reconciliation, collective responsibility, the role of moral considerations in politics, the Holocaust, genocide, crimes against humanity, education and the role of loving learning and nature as the nature of teaching as a vocation. And he's also contributed to the debate about the plight of universities. So welcome, Professor Gaita, and I will now hand over to the professor who will be giving us our final talk today. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Rebecca. Are you hearing me clearly?
Yes, we are.
Yes, sir, we can hear you. Yeah.
Oh, good. I'm afraid I have to explain to people before I start that I've recently been diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, which makes me very tired. And I've been prescribed medication, which for a time I didn't want to take because it can make you sleepy. And I thought if I was sleepy, I wouldn't be able to honor a number of commitments, including this one. But I was so exhausted anyhow that I decided to take it. And it has the bad effect. Well, it hasn't cured my exhaustion, but it has the bad effect of making my mood rather down. So if I sound flat, a bit flat to you, please don't think it's because of the occasion. It's not. I've been looking forward to this very much. Because I get so tired, I decided to write this out and to read it, which I know on Zoom is not the best thing to do. And I'll try and read slowly. It will take probably about 3/4 of an hour. What I've got is not even an attempt at fully developed argument of a position. It's rather a series of reflections and an attempt to create a conceptual space for certain kinds of reflections, which I hope will enable you located in that space to resist certain kinds of assumptions about what conceptually must be the case in a discussion of the kinds of things that I want to talk about. I wanted, in fact, to talk about what it can mean for we human beings to think of ourselves as essentially creatures of the earth, of what it can mean for that to define a sense of common humanity, either as a reality or an aspiration that assumes responsibility and expresses a kinship with the earth and all that is of it. And to do that, however, I need to talk about what I think it can mean to be a human being, and that in fact takes up the whole of my talk. The great cellist Pablo Casals wrote in his autobiography that every morning for 80 years, he went to the piano and played 2 preludes and fugues of Bach. He said it was a sort of benediction on the house, that it was a rediscovery of the world of which he had the joy of being a part. It filled him, he said, with a feeling of the incredible marvel of being a human being. I don't think a day has passed in my life, he said, in which I failed to look with fresh amazement at the miracle of nature. Well, few things I know are written more wonderfully in the key of gratitude. Casals' love of the world strikes me as an expression of a kind of humanism, which for many reasons can today seem exhausted and tattered. But before I approach that thought more directly, I'll read from a piece I wrote called We Creatures of the Earth, and which I believe was sent to you as preparation for this talk. And though I developed it, I don't develop that piece in this talk, it forms a critical part of the conceptual landscape in which to locate the main part of what I will have to say. I grew up in a part of central Victoria in Australia, and my wife and I have a property there. An Aboriginal friend honoured me by calling it my country, intending at least some of the spiritual resonances of the word country as Aboriginal peoples use it, without diminishing in the slightest the significance of the fact that it's the country of which the Dudja Warring people, an Aboriginal clan, were dispossessed. Growing up, I came to love it in its summer colours, and in deep and, as I still discover, unexpected ways, I was formed by my early life as an immigrant boy in its landscape and amongst the peoples who found and worked in its towns. But I now look at the summer beauty with a love made anxious by the threat of fire. Only when the grass turns green do I relax. When my wife and I landed at Melbourne Airport on a flight from London early January the 5th, 2020, in the midst of those terrible fires that ravaged part of the country of Australia, we took our bags to our home in a Melbourne suburb and unpacked them. Immediately afterwards, we drove to our home on the property, though we were exhausted by the flight. I felt compelled to do it, though I don't know why. The smoke from hundreds of kilometers away reduced visibility to about half a kilometer, but the property wasn't threatened by fire. The urgent imperative to go there was an expression of my grief for the earth and the things that belong to it, its creatures, of course, but also its trees and grasses, even the moss on the noble granite boulders that honor our property and its surrounds. And to explain this, or even for me properly to understand it, I'd have to be a poet. How deeply what it means to be human is connected to our living and dying on the earth has been sometimes bitterly controversial in Western cultural history. Our connection to the earth has been lamented at least as often as it's been celebrated. To say of someone that they've been brought to earth has always been ambivalent praise. On the one hand, it applauds sobriety and humility. On the other hand, it deplores betrayal of passion, of ideals to which we can remain true only when we look to the heavens. Plato's dual conviction that the body is the tomb of the soul found equally dispiriting forms of expression in most strands of Christianity. Well, attitudes of the body have changed. Disgust for it and most forms of sexuality are now regarded as forms of pathology. Hardly anybody talks disparagingly of earthly desires, and hostility to exploitative attitudes to nature and all that is of it is widespread. We desire to control, even if we can't reverse, the consequences of our exploitative hubris. For some, this expresses not much more than an enlightened self-interest, which includes, of course, our interest in preserving landscapes and species that we delight in. For others, and I include myself amongst them, the fires took us almost violently to a visceral reawakening of our creatureliness, to the full realization that, like the animals we saw fleeing the fires with terror in their hearts, we are creatures of flesh and blood. Their charged bodies forced us to acknowledge, not just in our beliefs, but to our living core, that we are essentially mortal beings, that unlike machines, we die rather than fall apart or break down beyond hope of repair. That dust to dust, ashes to ashes is the manner of our ending. Yet perhaps without being aware of the tension, at the same time that we seek to find a more awakened relation to our bodies, to other creatures, and to the earth, one that defines our humanity, we hope that science will soon enable us to replace damaged parts of our brains with the same material from which we will make robots who might relate to us, we hope, in full ethical fellowship, all the while believing we could retain a clear understanding of what us, that is, the us in relates to us, can mean in such circumstances. Robot makers have been saying for years that the interesting question is not when will robots become like us, it's when will we, with the replacement of our bodily parts with robot stuff, be like them. Nothing in the science of climate change is inconsistent with that thought, but the conception of the nature of our creatureliness, that the fires awakened in many people, looks to be at least we enjoy our bodies more than Plato thought we should, but perhaps we're no closer to believing they are essential to who we are than he was. Well, that's the end of my reading from Weak Creatures of the Earth, and now the main part of my talk, and it begins with some reflections on philosophy, which nowadays means, for the most part, as an academic practice. It's a minor consolation of Trump's rise to power, of his unstoppable mendacity, and the brazen justification of it by talk of fake news and alternative facts, that a progressive intelligentsia that had been suspicious of the concepts of fact and truth has now embraced them. The role of climate change in the frequency and severity of bushfires throughout the world and the evident need of scientists during the pandemic have also enhanced the prestige of expert advice to government. That's to be welcomed, but expertise must be contained to its proper domains. Climate change raises various kinds of ethical and political issues, as well as scientific and managerial ones. The misanthropy and the taste for authoritarian politics expressed by some climate change activists, for example. So too has the pandemic, the most pressing, focused on the benefits and harms of lockdowns. To deal with those ethical issues, people have turned to ethicists, a word that surprisingly has not inspired much satire. Ethicists, who are usually believed to be experts, advise doctors, medical researchers, business people, generals, immigration officials, artificial intelligence researchers, and many others who have come to acknowledge, some rather reluctantly, that a little more ethics would be a good thing in the public domain. Some ethicists are philosophers, many are not, but all need philosophy in the assessment of how they construe their problems and the solutions that they propose. The nature and state of philosophy is therefore of concern to anybody affected by what ethicists do, and indeed by all citizens. They should reflect on what it shows about the culture, for good or for ill, that ethicists exist, claiming often that to be experts. Moral philosophers disagree not only about what to do, but also about what morality is, if it is indeed one thing, which later on I'll suggest it's not, and about the kind of significance it should have in one's life. They disagree about what it is to do moral philosophy well, and even what it is to do it at all. The latter disagreement is philosophical, even when it's also an expression of professional arrogance. When the University of Cambridge offered Jacques Derrida an honorary doctorate, countless philosophers protested that he was undeserving of it, and some said it would shame the university, excuse me, that it would shame the university if it was seen to accept that he's a philosopher. Derrida was quick to return the compliment to the kind of philosophy that at the time was called Oxford philosophy. That was in 1992, but the situation now is much the same. There is nothing approaching a consensus amongst philosophers about whether the many kinds of disagreements between them are contingent and therefore resolvable, at least in principle, or whether they are intrinsic to the subject matter, at least of ethics. But the fact that such disagreement exists denies moral philosophers any legitimate claim to be moral experts of any kind. Scientists make discoveries that go into encyclopedias, for the most part without controversy, and sometimes they earn Nobel Prizes. And that tells us a lot about the kind of knowledge they seek and achieve, and that gives them the right to claim expertise. There are no Nobel laureates in morality or in moral philosophy, because nothing that is done in the discipline counts as a discovery in the same sense in which we speak of scientific discoveries. That does not, of course, mean that anything goes. There is such a thing as the mastery of a discipline, And philosophy in the analytical tradition, which prevails in most of the English-speaking world, is one of the most rigorous disciplines in the humanities. Every reflective, discursive culture needs it, I believe. But its academic practice requires impartiality in marking, in examining, in making appointments, and so on, which, if they are to be fair, depend on the acknowledgement of differences of the kind that I've just outlined. Amongst the disagreements within the analytical tradition and between it and the traditions dominant in Europe, one is about the role and importance of examples, real or imagined, and how to think clearly when we're moved by them. From one perspective, the fact that you were, because you were moved, it moved to the cognitive character of what you take to be the content of your awakening. The content, the argument goes, must be abstracted from the form in which it was delivered to you and moved you. When the extraction has been achieved and what is taken to be cognitively salient is expressed differently, often more abstractly or even rendered suitable for mathematical formulation, people sometimes complain of that abstractness, implying that a better, more concrete formulation would give greater weight to the heart. I believe that's a misleading way of putting something that's important. Rather than speaking of head and heart as different ways of responding that can be friendly to one another, provided they respect one another's rightful territory, I'd speak of a form of understanding in which feeling and thought can't be separated. It marks a distinctive form. Sensibility is a good name for it. When it's educated, as much in art, especially in literature, as in philosophy and other disciplines, it becomes critically attentive to things that the other conception I sketched regard as cognitively irrelevant, to tone, to demeanor, to a tendency to kitsch or to pathos, for example. We need such a sensibility, I believe, if we're to assess whether the value of what I said earlier about my responses to the fires and to the natural landscape is something that might have been a bit kitschy or has any real value in it at all. In the extract from the introduction to the classics edition of The Philosopher's Dog, which I believe has been circulated, I discussed this in connection with what I there called and elsewhere called the realm of meaning. And this is what I wrote. I quote now. I would not like the expression the realm of meaning to become a technical one, though the word realm gives it a slightly intimidating ring that I don't intend. When I coined it, I had in mind a way of thinking about the meaning of things in our lives, about what it means to love or to grieve truthfully, of why it matters that we do, about what it means to suffer wrong and what it means to do it. What counts as thinking well or badly about these matters is in part determined by concepts more often used in philosophy. Concepts like sentimentality, pathos, cliche, tone deafness, for example. Thinking about the meanings of things is necessarily answerable to such concepts because they partly determine its in which thought, feeling, style, and content are inseparable. And those concepts mark its distinctive cognitive character, and therefore the forms of the discursive that can best engage with it. For that reason, reflection in the realm of meaning should never wish to distance itself too much from the natural languages that nourish it, because that shape and are shaped by the lives of peoples. Reflection in the realm of meaning is inescapably and deeply in medias res, in the midst of things. And to a degree that even philosophers, like many Wittgensteinians, who emphasize the dependence of our concepts on ways of living, would find unnerving. I mean, we're so deeply in medias res that even such philosophers and certain kinds of pragmatists, I believe, would find it unnerving. But in discussion of this, some people appeal to Aristotle's observation that one should not demand more rigor from a subject than it permits. And he was right. Indeed, what he says is almost a tautology. But I would also say that the sensibility I've sketched does not compromise on rigor in ethical discussion because it believes the subject matter compels it to. Rather, it aspires to a different, but no less stringent rigor. And I'll say more about that later. Well, despite what I said earlier about the apparent demise of an exhausted and tattered humanism, it's striking how often we now speak, more often even than 10 years ago, I think, of humanity in ethically inflected registers or ethically resonant tones, as when, for example, we speak of seeing or failing to see the full humanity of people or peoples, of dehumanization, of the common humanity of all the peoples of the earth, or that some ways of being and living are not worthy of our humanity. It's also striking that people, some explicitly, more implicitly, speak of our humanity as something that's not given to us once and for all, as species membership is, but is something to which we are called upon to rise, not until such time as we achieve it, which might be different from one person to another, but unendingly for all of us until we die. Some people think of it as a gift that we betray. Casals, obviously would have thought of it as a gift we portray if we do not try to be lucid about things that matter most to us, or about what should matter most to us. Socrates meant it, I think, when in order to explain why he couldn't stop philosophizing, even under threat of death, he said that an unexamined life is not worthy of a human being. The two seem interdependent. To recognize the humanity of others, we must rise to the humanity in ourselves. But to do that, we must at least be open to seeing fully the full humanity of all the peoples of the earth. In a similar way, the acknowledgement of human rights, rights that all human beings are said to possess merely by virtue of being human, appears to be interdependent with the acknowledgement of a common humanity with them. The same is true for the recognition of what people sometimes call the dignity, with a capital D, the dignity of humanity, to which an unconditional respect is said to be owed, inalienably in every human being. And that's an affirmation to be found in preambles to important instruments of international law. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, for example, the Convention Against Torture. People who oppose torture as a weapon in the so-called war against terror after September 11th often appeal to this idea to express the thought that torture is a violation, the ultimate violation, Michael Ignatieff called it. In what I've said so far, I've repeatedly said seems to, appears to, because obviously things are not always as they appear. And in this connection, it's important to remember how varied are the inflections of the way we speak of humanity when we don't mean to speak directly of the species Homo sapiens. And the ethical inflections are diverse for two reasons. Firstly, there are many forms of the ethical. There's morality, politics, law, and love, for example. And secondly, the forms of the ethical are also various because there are different conceptions of the very nature of morality, politics, law, love, etc. On the surface, such ways of speaking of our humanity do not refer, nor do they even seem to rely upon the fact that, as far as we know it, all human beings are members of the species Homo sapiens. I remarked earlier on how varied are the ethical inflections of the way we speak of humanity when we don't intend to speak directly of the species. Be a human being for once in your life is not an injunction to be more fully a member of the species. Nor did Socrates mean that an unexamined life is not worthy of the species. Sometimes those ethical inflections are the expression of morality, and sometimes they are not. Always, and this is a version of a point that Cora Diamond made long ago, reference to humanity functions not as an explanation of why someone should do something, but as an ethical reminder that what they're called upon to rise to is part of a common understanding of what it means to be human. One might therefore wonder how much conceptual work the idea of humanity does in its variously ethically inflected uses. Perhaps someone might say it is merely a rhetorical way of speaking, and that the real work is done by the concept of a person or a rational agent. Those concepts, person, rational agent, don't appear to conflict as the ethically inflected ways of speaking of our humanity appears to, with the obvious possibility that beings who are not human beings, other animals, aliens, or one day perhaps robots, might become fully part of our ethical community, including our moral community. And it's important to see that at issue here is not whether the characteristic lives of human beings generates ethical content for us. Rather, what's at issue is what role the concept of the human has in our understanding of, for example, what it means to wrong somebody, and therefore our understanding of the distinctive kind of seriousness that morality can have in a person's life. The ways in which our ways of speaking of humanity are, as I said, inflected ethically, will depend on the ethical conceptions that give rise to those inflections. In international law, as it is now for us, though by no means only there, its ethical inflection is given in part by the idea of dignity, as I said before. Again, this is dignity with a big D, or the dignity of humanity, again with a big D. The preamble to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights speaks of, quote, the inherent dignity of all members of the human family and of the dignity and worth of the human person. The preamble common to both the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights echoes the Universal Declaration in speaking of the inherent dignity of all members of the human family. The preamble then states, and I quote, these rights derive from the inherent dignity of the human person. The Convention Against Torture also speaks in these ways. These preambles suggest that the idea of the dignity of humanity, of a dignity that a human being possesses simply by virtue of being a human being, underpins the concept of an inalienable right and is fundamental to an elaboration of what it means morally to violate such a right. And of course, what it means morally to violate those other prescriptions of international law. The moral character of crimes against humanity is often rendered as an offense against the human dignity of those who suffer from, and it's now almost second nature to us to speak of human rights and the dignity that has been offended when a person's human rights are violated. And indeed, we live in times when it comes relatively easy for us to speak in this way. Now, I don't know quite how extensive the we to which I've been constantly appealing is. I've been appealing to it as an invitation to agreement or disagreement rather than as any kind of generalization. But it is significant that these expressions appear in preambles to those instruments of law that is international. And it's natural to take their role in those preambles as suggesting that they should inform ethical elaboration of what it would mean to offend against those laws. Cultures have existed in which there was not even a hint of an awareness of those ethical concepts. And cultures now exist which regard them as absurd. Absurd to think that even the most brutal politicians, or let's say perhaps the most brutal leaders of ISIS, for example, are owed a fair trial for their sake as human beings, rather than because it might affect the integrity of legal systems by putting them on a slippery slope. Or to put that from a perspective of one who believes it was for their sake as human beings that this should be done, only if they were tried in that spirit, that is, that justice was owed to them for their sake, with the integrity of the legal system remain intact. And that, I think, is an imperative so sublime. I mean, the imperative I mean is that no matter how foul someone's behavior, no matter how foul their character, no matter even if you can see nothing whatsoever in them from which a sober remorse might grow, such a person is for their sake owed justice and should never be regarded as someone we should wish to rid the world of as though they were vermin. That I think is an imperative so sublime that the fact that we should see it in something that appears so prosaic as the imperatives of a legal system might make us complacent about it and forgetful of how wondrous it is that humanity should ever have come to such an affirmation. In much of my work, I've tried to reclaim a sense of that wondrousness and to create the right conceptual backdrop against which it will again speak to us. Well, the world looks very different to people who believe that every human being possesses an inalienable dignity to which unconditional respect is owed than it does to those who do not believe it. It informs their ethical inflections of the way in which they talk about it, but it doesn't offer a justification of those inflections. They'll understand differently what it means to wrong somebody, what it means for a person to be fully aware of that wrong, because it will give, as I said earlier, a distinctive content to the idea of a violation. And that will affect their understanding of what it is to see or to fail to see someone as fully human, and therefore what talk of a common humanity might come to. They'll understand differently most of the virtues and the vices and what compassion and love most truly are. The golden rule that one should always treat others as one would wish to be treated, which many people take to be the basic precept of morality and to capture the essence of the biblical command to love one's neighbor, that too will be understood differently by those who believe that human beings possess inalienable dignity from those who do not. Or to take a different example, many of us warm to the idea that empathy or compassion should be at the heart of our ethics, without realizing that empathy for someone who has been wronged will be different if you understand that wrong as a violation of their inalienable dignity than if you don't. Empathy can't take you to that concept of a violation. The kind of empathy whose nature is informed by it depends on the prior possession of it. And the same is true for compassion. But it'll now be evident that I don't equate ethics with morality. Though the distinction between morality and ethics is an old one, there's no agreement about how to draw it. I think of the ethical as a realm in which we think about the meanings of things in our lives. We think about morality, of course, but also about law, politics, and other matters, about the demands intrinsic to the various forms of love and how to rise to them, for example. I think of these as distinctive realms of value, sui generis, in complex ways interconnected and sometimes in conflict. Love in all its forms has ethical standards intrinsic to it, standards that distinguish love from its many false semblances, its many counterfeits. Love of one's friends may conflict with love of country, both with morality, morality with politics, and both with law. So though I write in the singular of the ethical, I'd not do so of the values in its domain. There are many conceptions of morality, not only of what to do, but also about what it is, what kind of place it can or should have in our lives. And what's important here is it's not just about what to do, but also about the spirit in which something is done. Something that you might have noticed in recent discussions about triaging. Here's an example for the times, and it's in fact about triaging. Were I now in a hospital, 75 years old, suffering from an incurable degenerative disease, and told that I could not be put on a ventilator because it had to go to a younger person, I'd consent to it. I wouldn't think of this as above and beyond the call of duty. For me, this is ethically a no-brainer, which doesn't mean that I believe that anybody in a similar situation should think as I do, including the young person who would get the ventilator. But certainly I would not respond graciously if that person said, "Good on you, old man. You've made the right decision, impersonally considered. You've done your civic duty in this time of critically scarce resources." And if that person were to add that just by looking at me could tell that I had not much quality of life left in me, I'd snatch the ventilator back. And this is, I don't know if you know, but there's a concept called quality adjusted life years, which is promoted by certain philosophers like Julian Savulescu, and in which, according to which such decisions ought to be made. Well, the considerations of the quality of my life before or after would play little, if any, role in my decision. I wouldn't try to assess how many years I had to live and how good or bad they would be. I've had a wonderful life, but if it had been miserable and now the future looked good, I'd lament my bad luck at not being able to enjoy life for the first time. But that would not enter my thinking about what to do. Nor would it matter if the young person were a chronic alcoholic, a wife beater, and a laborer who would easily be replaced at work. Or on the other hand, if he were an exemplary citizen, a brilliant doctor with rare talents, able to do much good. Such considerations would strike me as indecent as the claim that the brilliant and productive people in the Nazi death camps should have been saved ahead of the dullards, the criminals, or those whose spirit appeared to be damaged beyond healing. But I would hope that the spirit in which the ventilator was denied me would not be informed by the kind of consequentialism that gave birth to the idea of quality adjusted life years, or indeed that informs its conception of well-being. If it were, then I think I had become dispensable in a community that had meant much to me, that my humanity was no longer fully visible to its members who were not mortally vulnerable to the virus, one of whom had given it to me. Well-being and quality of life, therefore, are not morally neutral concepts that can form the basis of morality. It's part of my conception of my well-being, not just as the individual, and not just as an individual human being, but as a member of a political community, that the hard moral philosophy, as the University of Melbourne Vice-Chancellor described the quality concept and the consequentialism that gave birth to it. It's part of my conception of my well-being as a member of a political community that such a philosophy should not even be seriously considered. Along with many political constituencies throughout the world, we are divided not only between ourselves, but within ourselves. All of us are heirs to or are affected in our ethical thinking by complex, sometimes conflicting traditions that inform how we see the world ethically. We are seldom fully aware of what determines the deepest source of even the values most dear to us. In a community whose members disagree deeply and widely about what to do and about what morality is, what kind of importance it has in our life, the concept of striking the right balance between lives and livelihoods, or between liberty and lives, for example, can play at best an attenuated role. Its application depends on agreement about the weight of considerations put on the scales, and more radically, on what the metaphor of weighing comes to when ethical disagreement is at issue. The same is true of the concept, all things duly considered. Well, betrayal, murder, and cruelty are examples of moral wrongs. When Socrates said that it's better to suffer evil than to do it, he had such wrongs in mind, amongst others, of course. And when he said he couldn't give up philosophizing even under the threat of death because an unexamined life is not worthy of a human being, he expressed a sense of ethical impossibility. But it would go against the grain, I believe, for us to call this moral impossibility. Like Socrates, some people believe that they must live their lives with lucidity for reasons that are not prudential. They may believe that they must seek a truthful understanding of their past, though not because they hope it will have practical benefits for their future. Others believe that understanding the past matters only insofar as it serves the future. From the first perspective, your second might look superficial, but surely not immoral. I had a friend, a brilliant young philosopher, who fell ill with schizophrenia. We talked about his illness one crisp morning, walking on Clapham Common in London, speaking of his severely diminished capacity to do philosophy, and of the terror of not being able to use his mind to determine whether he was losing it. He said, "I try to keep my eyes open." I was profoundly moved. Why did he try? Well, I think like Socrates, he thought it to be an imperative intrinsic to the dignity of his humanity. In thinking about how we should understand the significance of ethically inflected ways of speaking of our humanity, it will help to think of the two different kinds of inquiries or realms of reflection that I sketched earlier. The first is one in which it's an ideal that cognitive content should in principle always be extractable from the form in which it's delivered, typically a natural language, which from this perspective has uncontrollable emotive and rhetorical resonances that threaten clear vision of that content. The second is what I call the realm of meaning, in which if, and that's a big if, the subject matter is adequately described, reflection is inescapably answerable to the categories that define the distinctive cognitive character of that realm. The distinction corresponds to some degree at any rate, or perhaps better, it can give content to a distinction between reflection on human nature and reflection on the human condition. It's not a sharp distinction, and there's plenty of back and forth between these domains of reflection. I think of human nature as revealed to us in experience, corrected and deepened by the sciences. In fact, this gives one kind of meaning to the concept of experience when it's interchangeable with the empirical, as we speak of it, for example, when we speak of a claim needing empirical support. And with a distinction between depth and shallowness and what is appearance and what is deeper, to which science will take us. I mean, science will take us to a deeper understanding beneath the appearances, usually in the form actually of always more general laws. When claims about human nature are characteristically empirical claims, and when there is a non-collusive agreement about them certified by a community of relevant scholars, usually scientists of one kind or another, they find their way into textbooks and encyclopedias, and sometimes, as I remarked earlier, justifiably earn Nobel Prizes. And this, as I also suggested earlier, is a paradigm for our notion of expertise. Reflection on the human condition, by contrast, is on the meanings that human beings have made of the big facts of life: birth, death, sexuality, a vulnerability to misfortune, most importantly. It's also reflection on what we are to make ethically of the discoveries of the sciences, how we're to take those discoveries into our lives. Again, as I said earlier, reflection of this kind makes no groundbreaking discoveries. In fact, the concept of discovery in anything like the way it applies in science, which is interdependent with a kind of non-collusive agreement I spoke of a moment ago, that concept of discovery is for the most part alien to it. Of course, we do strive for understanding and we strive to deepen it. Insofar as it's available, we aim for wisdom rather than just cleverness, and for lucidity about how things mean to us. We try to see things as they are rather than as they appear to us. However, the conceptual character of such efforts to see things as they are, for example, is different in reflection on the human condition, insofar as that is reflection in the realm of meaning, than it is for reflection on human nature. Thinking about the human condition, or to put it less portentously, thinking about the meanings of things informed by a history of reflection about the human condition, requires, of course, conscientious attention to relevant evidence of a factual kind, an empirical kind. It requires that we think logically, patiently, carefully about how we move from one thought to another. But it also requires an educated sensibility of the kind that I've been trying to describe. Its development is not optional to reflection about the human condition, indeed about anything that really matters ethically. Without it, we will not only think badly about these matters, we will see our subject matter from a distorted perspective of what genuine cognitive achievement really comes to, and therefore be disposed to a reductionist account of our subject matter. Thinking well in the realm of meaning presupposes a different conception of experience than the one that governs reflections on human nature. It's the kind we mean when we say it takes experience to grow wise, takes time to grow wise, or when we say that a person needs to find their own voice, to speak from the standpoint of someone who's lived through their experiences and with their experiences with some authenticity. And corresponding to that are different conceptions of depth and shallowness, of coming to see things as they are rather than as they appear. And as I said earlier, of what it is for things to be as they are in this domain of reflection. Now, in saying all that, I don't want to revive a polemic about two cultures. Discussion of the relation between the sciences and the humanities needs to be rescued from the assumptions that informed that old debate, almost as much as it needs to be rescued from the poisonous inanities of the cultural wars. The fundamental impact of science on our understanding of what it means to be human is undeniable. It's deepened immeasurably understanding of ourselves as creatures of the earth and as material beings in the universe. Neuroscience has altered our understanding of the mind, and even evolutionary psychology has had considerable influence on moral psychology, and through it, moral and political philosophy. It's also fed reductionist impulses in real and pop philosophy, but that's another matter. Recent developments in technology have affected our lives directly in dramatic ways and altered our ways of thinking and imagining ourselves. Yet only when they're engaged with the humanities are the natural sciences able to contribute to an understanding of the human meaning of their discoveries, indeed of their meaning period. Only when it's engaged with moral, legal, and political philosophies that are historically informed and imaginatively engaged with art can evolutionary theory, for example, deepen our understanding of the human condition. And a reflection on the value of truth, what concern for it can mean in a human life, is obviously best suited to the humanities. The novelist Isaac Bashevis Singer said that every writer needs an address. I think he would concede that it can be more than one. The constraints on how many one can have are set by the number in which one can, the constraints on how many addresses one can have is set by the number in which the sensibility that I sketched earlier can develop and flourish. All good writers try to avoid kitsch, sentimentality, pathos, and more. There's no point in even trying to do it in a language in which one is not at home. Writers find their voice in a natural language when they're alive to its historical resonances and allusions. And though Singer was thinking of novelists, poets, and playwrights, what he said applies to anyone whose thought is answerable to the concepts that define what it is to think well or badly about the meaning of things in life. That's in which they're conversing. When something serious comes up between Facebook friends who are also actual friends, they'll say, "It's time now to talk." And they don't mean on Facebook or Messenger, they mean face to face. They must talk. Sometimes one must call the other to a responsive, embodied attention. If things go badly, we might hear one of them say, "Stop shouting. You talk as though you're still on Facebook. Where are you coming from? Where's your address?" I think many people realize this when they suffer protracted lockdowns. Sometimes when we don't understand everything that others say at the time they say it, we trust what they say will allow it to enter our lives, to find in its own time ways to engage with what we already know and with our capacities, emotional, intellectual, and spiritual, for understanding. When I was a student or teacher, whose name was Martin Winkler, said something to me that shook me to the core, it turned out. I was defending a friend who expressed a prissy, condescending conception of social responsibility, disdainful of what he called the mass hysteria of kids at Beatles concerts in the 1960s. Winkler detested what I was defending. He listened for a long time. Just past midnight, he placed his hands on the table, leant forward, holding me fast in a look I could not avoid, and said, "Gaita, do you know what the core of responsibility is? It's responsiveness to the needs of another in a lived encounter." I'm quoting this from memory. I didn't understand what he meant, but was profoundly moved. He said I should read Martin Buber's I and Thou. I didn't understand that either. Almost 30 years later, I dedicated my first book, Good and Evil, An Absolute Conception, to Winkler. I could have subtitled it Responsiveness to Need. I'm still grateful for his loving severity. Winkler probably knew I didn't understand, but he trusted that one day I might. To do that, he had to trust that I wasn't seduced by his charismatic personality, powerfully expressed in his dramatic demeanor that evening. He cared for me and wanted me to learn to think for myself. He called me, as I put it elsewhere, to an individuating responsiveness, to be wholly alive and alert, to answer and later reflect critically upon what he told me, allowing it to be formed by and to inform experiences that were part of my history and had made me who I was. That presupposes a collectedness in the present moment and over time, not consistent with experimenting with multiple selves, as social media has encouraged many people to do. Some years ago, I rented a cottage near a country town in order to finish a book. In fact, it was The Philosopher's Dog. It was at a time in Australian politics when the Australian government had instigated a brutal response to asylum seekers coming by boat. Often I had dinner in a pub in town where I discussed those policies with locals. At the time, some children had been behind razor wire for 5 years. They had seen adults try to kill themselves or sew their lips together. I argued that the policy was unjust and cruel. But we need border protection. We need to stop queue jumpers. If we're lenient in a handful of cases, who knows where that will end up, I was told. And my counter arguments were as familiar to them as their arguments were to me. We were getting nowhere, so I tried something different. I know, I said, that the issue is complex, that no one can seriously believe that anyone can live where they please in the world. But do we need to be so cruel to children? But they're queue jumpers. We have to be tough, came the reply. I know, I said, but let's focus one thing only. Do we need to be so cruel to children? The man I was talking to shifted from one foot to another. He avoided my eyes. I repeated the question in a tone that stopped him moving. He looked directly at me. Do we need to be so cruel? I asked again. He stood still and kept looking at me, perhaps for more than 30 seconds. That may not sound a long time, but it feels that way when someone looks you directly in the eyes. He agreed. We don't have to be so cruel. And in the case of the adults, I asked, do we need to be so cruel to them? Again, the same first line of responses. And again, he shifted from one foot to another. Again, he stood still, looked hard at me before he agreed. We shouldn't be so cruel, not even to the adults. This happened a few times with other people at the pub, and is another example of what I mean by a call to seriousness. I emphasized the physical aspects of my conversation with a person in the country pub to illustrate how being embodied in the way that we are was intrinsic to that encounter. Were it not so, there would be no such thing as a call to seriousness as I've been describing it. And I believe no such thing as we celebrate when we say, exclaim, at last, someone really to talk to. Though I believe our creatureliness is fundamental to our humanity, humanity as we speak of it in ethically inflected tones is not a natural kind concept, which is to say that if it turned out that some human beings were in fact not members of the species Homo sapiens, we would not believe we'd been mistaken in treating them as human beings. We would not necessarily think that either we had been mistaken in treating them as fellow human beings, or that the scientific classification of what it is to be a member of the species Homo sapiens was mistaken. The reasons for this, which I've tried to develop in my book, A Common Humanity, and also in The Philosopher's Dog, are, I believe, to be found in Wittgenstein's later philosophy. If I'm right in claiming that our ethically inflected ways of speaking of humanity can extend to beings who are not members of the species Homo sapiens, then one reason why people believe the concept of a person or a rational agent does the work that is carried in those inflections will lose its attractions. How distant from us they can be in their appearances and ways of living and be accepted in full ethical fellowship cannot, I believe, be even in principle determined in advance by theoretical considerations. But I think we would have to find it intelligible that they are with us in the kind of conceptual space in which it's intelligible that we can call them to the kind of seriousness and therefore to the kind of individuating responsiveness of which I've spoken. At any rate, we must see how we respond and what comes from reflection on those responses. Or to put it another way, we must be able to find ourselves together in the realm of meaning, extended though it may have become. In that realm, the possibility, the ever-present possibility of a call to seriousness is what gives normative authority to the concepts that define the realm as a distinctively cognitive one. I'll conclude now with a quotation from Hannah Arendt. The quote is from On Humanity in Dark Times and is published in her book, Men in Dark Times. And this is the quote. The world is not humane just because it is made by human beings. And it does not become so just because the human voice sounds in it, but only when it has become the object of human discourse. However much we are affected by things of the world, however deeply they may stir and stimulate us, they become human for us only when we can discuss them with our fellows. Whatever cannot become the object of discourse, the truly sublime, the truly horrible, the uncanny, may find a human voice through which to sound into the world, but it is not exactly human. We humanize what is going on in the world, in ourselves, only by speaking of it. And in the course of speaking of it, we learn to be human. That's it. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Professor Gaita. That's absolutely wonderful. And I think now what we're going to do is, before we take the questions, is we will have a break now for 15 minutes, if that's okay with you. So
Yes,
you can,
that's fine.
yeah, have a relax now, have a cup of tea. Nathan and I will be busy in the background fielding the questions. And so, yes, thank you very much for marvellous talk, and please do come back in 15 minutes if you can.
I will.
And to everyone else, the chat will now open, so you can now start posting your questions. Thank you.